I want to welcome everybody down here to Georgia. We are in the center of elections, it feels like this year, and it's very exciting. As Atiba said, I am an assistant professor of political science at Morehouse College, founded in 1867, and it is the only historically Black college and university, or HBCU, dedicated to the education of Black men. And it is the alma mater of Martin Luther King Jr., who is our most famous graduate, and who of course has a social justice mission, as does our college. So I'm very excited to be at Morehouse because my focus is on the American development of Black people politically and legally in the United States over time. And much of that has to do with the ability to vote. And my main topic of study is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I wrote a dissertation on, and which I think forms the foundation of what I'm gonna talk to you about tonight. And my goal was to speak with you first about the history of Georgia and voter suppression, because ultimately I would argue that Georgia is the epitome of voter suppression, both what we saw in the primary in 2018 and historically. And also this history that I want to talk with you about is relevant to what we're seeing in the elections that we're engaging in today. And so I think they'll provide you some perspective and will allow you to be able to think about, once we are fully analyzing the general election, once we take a look at the runoffs, to decide, for example, whether or not Georgia should be recovered by the Voting Rights Act, which I'll talk about because it is not right now. So I urge you to think about today, because you will not come to a conclusion, whether or not you think Georgia should be covered by what would now be the Voting Rights Recovery Act, which has been recently named for John Lewis, who of course died recently and dedicated his life to establishing the right to vote for Black people in the United States. So despite the fact that Georgia was established as a white state, really for debtors, slavery came to Georgia in 1751. And so when the nation was formed, it really was dedicated to white supremacy and to the exclusion of Black voters. So when you look at the constitutions for Georgia in 1776, 77, 1790, 1798, you will see that Black voters are unable to vote by constitution in the state of Georgia. Eventually though, post-Civil War, during radical Reconstruction, Black people in Georgia were able to vote. And in particular, in 1868, 37 Black state legislators were elected to the State House. And during that same year, Georgia ratified the 14th Amendment. And these two things combined allowed the state to get itself reunified into the Union post-Civil War, having been under military control and excluded from being able to participate. So as soon as the state of Georgia got rejoined the Union, on a bipartisan basis in the State House, all of those state legislators who were Black were essentially evicted from the State House, except for the 4 who were too light-skinned for people to be able to identify as Black. And as a result of that behavior, the Union actually remilitarized the state of Georgia, excluded it again from the Union, and demanded that it adjust to the radical Reconstruction program in order to come back into the Union. So in 1870, the state of Georgia did this, and it re-ratified the 14th Amendment, it ratified the 15th Amendment, and was able to be a part of the United States once again. And at this point, Black people are having some participation in the state of Georgia electoral politics, it's also very violent and dangerous and not necessarily safe. So the Ku Klux Klan starts in Georgia in 1868, and between about 1872 and 1876, you have folks who are elected officials and Black in Georgia, and many of them were threatened, beaten, some of them murdered, but they made their way fairly well until 1877, when, as a result of the presidential election in 1876 between Hayes and Tilden, which essentially was a tie and was thrown to Congress, the political parties made a compromise. And the compromise was that in exchange for taking the presidency, the Republican Party was going to remove military control from the South. And so they did that, and promptly a state like Georgia passed another constitution that did not allow Black people to vote, and it resumed its leadership with regard to voter suppression. And so in the state of Georgia, when Jim Crow began, Georgia was really a leader, and it used all of the kinds of tactics that we're familiar with from Jim Crow. Poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding tests, economic violence. And by that, I mean, I'm down here trying to register to vote, and therefore I'm gonna lose my job or my sharecropping situation or my ability to feed myself. And then of course, literal physical violence. And that of course was maintained in the state for almost 100 years. Throughout this 100-year period, the state is dedicated to maintaining white supremacy. So if you read the history of Georgia politics, you'll see that many of our governors ran on white supremacist, blatant campaigns. And you might also know that in 1917, the state established what was called the county unit system. And this also enabled white supremacy to prevail. So in the larger counties, there are 159 counties in the state of Georgia. And in the 8 largest counties, you would essentially be assigned 2 units for every representative that you had. So for 8 of the big urban counties, including places like Fulton, where Atlanta sits, where you might have 3 representatives, you would get 6 county unit votes. In the next tier, there are 30 counties that had 2 representatives each, they would get 4 units. And then 121 rural counties that are predominantly white and majority Southern Democratic have 1 representative and they get 2 units. However, this gave them basically 60% of the vote share. So it facilitated white supremacist candidates, white supremacist control, and it meant that you didn't have to ever win a majority in the popular vote in order to be able to win major statewide, and even in some cases, some local seats that were using this county unit system. And that county unit system lasted until the 1960s. In 1962, the Supreme Court began this Baker versus Carr line of cases where it essentially mandated 1 person, 1 vote for federal districting. And then in a couple of other cases, that was extended to states and to localities. And then in 1964, the Supreme Court struck the county unit system. And actually in the same year, the Supreme Court struck the county unit system so that Georgia was no longer able to use this very strong system that was allowing Southern Democrats and white supremacy to control the state. Important to this ending of the county unit system and to the development of the system that we're seeing now, and of course right now we're in the middle of the run up to 2 important Senate runoffs in the state, and runoffs were established in 1963 by a legislator named Denmark Grover, who served in the State House intermittently in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and a little bit in the 80s. But in 1958, he lost his seat in a race where there were 2 white candidates and 1 Black. And as a result, the white voters split the white vote and the Black candidate won. And this upset Grovey significantly. So when he got a seat back in 1963, he proceeded to propose what we now are seeing as this you have to earn 50% plus 1. And if you do not, then you're going to have a runoff. And this was going to guarantee that any races where there were 2 white candidates and a Black candidate, the white voters might split their vote in the primary, but the white candidate would definitely win in the general election. So just maintaining that system. Also, starting in 1957 and in the early 1960s, we see some additional reforms in the form of Civil Rights Act. And so the Civil Rights Act of 57, 60, 64, these are all actually aimed at opening the electorate to Black people who have largely been prevented from voting because of the Jim Crow system that began in the 1880s after that Hayes-Tilden Compromise. So these pieces of legislation, however, only provide litigation to provide relief for voter discrimination. This, of course, puts the burden on plaintiffs in a state to sue their state, claim and prove that they've had voter discrimination happen to them and get relief. But of course, litigation is expensive. It takes a long time. Often the election that you're complaining about is already over. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy this week when we see the president engaging in all this litigation that's happening, at warp speed. But just in general, litigation is not necessarily the most effective method for getting relief when you are being discriminated in your state based in the franchise. So civil rights activists, one of them being Martin Luther King, are lobbying President Johnson in 1965 for a voting rights bill. And President Johnson is reticent because he has just managed to have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, and he's telling them that it's really just too soon. And actually 2 days before Bloody Sunday, that first run of the Selma to Montgomery March, Martin Luther King and others visited the president and he turned them down on this Voting Rights Act. But of course, in this first effort to literally walk from Selma to Montgomery, which is motivated by a state trooper's killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, which of course sounds familiar, and which motivates civil rights activists in Selma to want to walk to the Capitol in Montgomery and confront Governor George Wallace. So in this attempt to make this march, they are crossing over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which of course is named for a Grand Master of the Ku Klux Klan, and they experience bloody pushback from state authorities. When they reach the edge of the bridge, this is photographed and filmed. And at this point, television is pretty prolific and it's very quick for them to be able to get these images that are happening on the bridge of people having their heads knocked, being hit with billy clubs, run over by horses. And people in the United States see this in the evening on television in the middle of an airing of a special called Justice at Nuremberg, which allows them to easily see the parallels between Nazi Germany and the United States. And obviously these images are also broadcast around the world so that our democratic ideals are in question. We're in the middle of this Vietnam period. This encourages President Johnson to pass a voting rights bill. And he and his Attorney General, Katzenbach, have been working on this already. And they establish and propose the Voting Rights Act. So I don't know how much you know about the Voting Rights Act, but I'd like to just tell you a few things. And 3 main parts of the Voting Rights Act that I want you to leave with are Section 2, Section 4, and Section 5. Now, I'll start by saying that the Voting Rights Act allows the federal government to participate in the registration of Black voters. And that's really what the Johnson administration, once the law is passed, uses it for, right? He's already done this politically touchy thing of passing this law. And so he really puts his energy into registering voters. It also allows observers to come from the federal government to elections. And then it has these important provisions. Section 2, which is just like the former Civil Rights Acts, it allows for litigation. Section 4 is a formula section, and Section 4 identifies states under the Voting Rights Act that are going to be what's called covered, and they're going to be covered under Section 5, which provides for preclearance. Now, under Section 4, this formula section, if in 1964, less than 50% of your voting age Black people are registered to vote, and you have persistently been using one of these tactics that we talked about from Jim Crow, then you're going to qualify to be covered under Section 5. And under Section 5, the preclearance provision, your state is now going to have to submit new voting laws to the federal government, usually to the Department of Justice. It's also allowed for states and jurisdictions to submit voting law changes to the District Court of the District of Columbia. But traditionally, they're going to the Department of Justice, to what is eventually the Voting Rights section. And then that section is evaluating the law for discrimination against Black voters, and then making a determination about whether or not that law is pre-cleared or whether or not they have an objection. And if they have an objection, then they're going to force you to rewrite the law or not allow you to enact it. Now, this shifts that burden away from the plaintiff, away from having to spend a lot of money to challenge a law after it's already been passed, and puts the onus on the state. And the original Voting Rights Act covers basically Confederate states. I wrote them down. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Michigan, South Carolina, Virginia. It also covers portions of California, New York, New Hampshire, Alaska, Arizona, and others. So this system just made a sea change in voting. So in the next couple of years, almost immediately, 250,000 Black people in the South registered to vote. And then it also has a positive impact on the election of Black elected officials. So, by 1991, we have 160 members of Congress, up from basically 0 at the beginning of this period. So you've got this new law, it's protecting people. Now, one of the important things about the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 is that it's temporary. So the idea is that once there's parity in voting, then Congress isn't going to need to reauthorize it, because Black people and white folks are all voting basically at the same level. And so we're no longer going to need the preclearance provision. But of course, we never reach parity, even though the Voting Rights Act is extremely important and significant to the protection of minority voters. And so the law was reauthorized in 1970, 1975, 1982, and importantly in 2006. And each one of these times there is dissent, first from Southern Democrats and later from Republicans, holding the conservative view in Congress. However, because the electorate has expanded, and particularly in the South, which is where most of the covered states exist, representatives are aware that they have Black constituents now. And so they're loath to be the responsible for canceling out this preclearance provision that has had such a significant impact. I also forgot to mention that in 1975, the Voting Rights Act was expanded to include bilingual minorities. So you have bilingual ballots and you have assistance with bilingual voting. Okay, so that said, in 2006, the state of Georgia, even though the two parties had agreed, because of polarization, because of the importance of the law, the two parties had agreed on a bipartisan basis that they would reauthorize the Voting Rights Act basically without change, And what had been happening at each reauthorization was sort of an update of the same formula, changing the presidential election date and maintaining essentially coverage over these states, and then expanding it to New York, to California, to Florida, to additional jurisdictions in additional states. Hawaii, again, some of these are bilingual coverage and some of these are sort of regular Section 5 coverage. And so in 2006, you see this agreement to pass the law, but led by the Georgia contingency, there is strong dissent by Republicans in 2006. And there's also the knowledge by everybody that the Voting Rights Act is probably going to be challenged and that Section 5 might be struck. This is concerning to proponents of the Voting Rights Act. And so in Congress, proponents of the act build this huge record to make sure that when this challenge comes, the Supreme Court's not going to be able to strike Section 5. However, as soon as that law got passed, the law gets challenged by a case in Texas, North Austin Municipal District #1 versus Holder. And surprisingly, the Supreme Court doesn't really mess with Section 5 in what is also known as the Mudd case, but Chief Justice John Roberts takes the opportunity to write basically his decision and describe all the reasons why the Voting Rights Act is probably unconstitutional. This invites a second challenge, which we see in Shelby versus Holder. And there, the Supreme Court doesn't strike Section 5 either. It's actually still a part of the law. But what it did strike was the Section 4 formula, saying that the formula was no longer up to date and that basically it discriminated against the states that were covered by it, and therefore it was no longer constitutional. This is what Justice Roberts said. Justice Ginsburg wrote a very important dissent where she basically indicated in similar but different terms, ending the Voting Rights Act at this point when it has worked and it continues to work is like throwing away your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you aren't getting wet. Now, what's also happening in the 2000s is that the Republican Party, in particular the American Legislative Exchange Commission, is passing voter ID laws. And voter ID laws and the similar tactics and laws are direct affront to the Voting Rights Act. So coming into that 2006 reauthorization and coming into 2013, this is also after Obama has been elected, we are seeing the proliferation of these voter ID laws, which are designed to limit the ability of minorities, older people, and there's one more category, older voters, Black voters, and poorer voters to be able to access the polls. These are also constituencies that tend to vote Democratic. So you have this tension between these new voter ID laws, which after the Shelby decision just become sort of standard fare. And so when I say voter ID, I mean voter ID, but I also mean aggressive polling purges or voting roll purges. I mean the closing of polling places, et cetera. And you see states start to do these things on the same day that the Shelby decision comes down. So Texas has a voter ID law that's already been rejected under the voting rights pre-clearance review. They pass it the same day that Shelby gets decided. North Carolina passed their voter ID law. It had been rejected under the Voting Rights Act about a month later. Now their ID law was so pointed, the Supreme Court said it had surgical precision at its attempt to discriminate against Black voters. And so eventually that law was still struck. However, states like Georgia, you see expanding their use of voter identification. In 2010, we see Brian Kemp get appointed to the Secretary of State position. He establishes an exact match. He does extremely aggressive purging of the Georgia voting rolls. As many as 1.5 million voters are purged from the polls. In 2015, he writes this very notable memo to polling locations and counties, asking them to consider closing polling locations. Many of these closures are in Black areas. There are 1,688 polls that closed between 2012 and 2018 in the nation, and 214 of those were in the state of Georgia. So you see the impact of the lack of protection that was provided by the Voting Rights Act in the state of Georgia as soon as, this, as early as 2010, but it really ramps up after 2013. And you also see the impact of the end of the Voting Rights Act in 2016, where lots of Black voters in Wisconsin, in Florida, in Michigan were prevented from being able to participate in the election because of voter ID and similar laws. Eventually, of course, we get to the 2018 gubernatorial election in Georgia, where we see Governor Kemp, now Governor Kemp, then Secretary of State, refusing to step down as Secretary of State as he runs against Stacey Abrams. He's using all of the mechanisms that I mentioned that he sort of started working in 2010, 2012. So he's got severe purges from the voting rolls. He's using exact match, which is keeping Black voters and other voters away from the polls. And then, of course, he's got this conflict of interest. And all of these tactics and activities are things that would have been curtailed by the Voting Rights Act had the Section 4 formula still been active, and therefore Section 5 still been able to do some work to protect minority voters. But that didn't happen. And so we end up with an election where, many people dispute whether or not Stacey Abrams actually lost that race. She, of course, never actually officially conceded, although she did recognize Brian Kemp as the governor. And she, instead of sort of resting on her laurels or crawling into a hole, established Fair Fight, and along with some other organizations in the state of Georgia, has done much to bring attention to voter suppression, bring resources to minority voters, make sure that minority voters get canvassed so that they understand that they are a part of the election, and get people out to vote in advance of this 2020 election period. So we also saw serious voter suppression in the June 9th primary, right? 7-hour, 10-hour, 12-hour lines, not enough polling places. Some people didn't get their absentee, that's incorrect. In 2018, people didn't get their absentee ballots. In the June primary, the absentee ballot thing was already working because of the pandemic. But we had these long lines, not enough polling places, polling workers not well trained enough, and issues that resulted in people having a really hard time, particularly in Black areas in Georgia, reaching the polls. That seems to have remedied itself to some degree during the general election. People got more familiar with the vote by mail. And even though the state of Georgia has complained quite a bit about the vote by mail system, it's been pretty active. Applications have gone out. It's been very easy to sign up for the absentee ballots. They take a little bit of time to come, but people seem to have used them. And so after a couple of heavy, sticky, early voting days, the actual general election was pretty smooth. Now, laid over this, of course, is the election of our president in 2016, the current president, who took up this mantle of voter suppression and has really been complaining about it since he got into office in 2016, I think in preparation for this 2020 election, which he first tried to destabilize and now is trying to contradict, including doing things like calling our governor to ask him to replace our electors with electors who support him. And the governor has said he's not going to do that. The person, Gabrielle Sterling, who's running the election, has actually complained about the administration. because it is a violation of Georgia voting law. It's a violation of our ideas about democracy. And frankly, it's dangerous for people. A number of legal leadership as well as electoral leadership like Gabrielle Sterling, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, and others have received threats, death and otherwise. And there's concern about violence in the state because a lot of people, I think, do believe the presidential administration's assertions that there has been voter fraud, whereas I would argue that those complaints are fraudulent because it has been repeatedly proven that voter fraud is almost a 0% phenomenon in the United States, and it is not something that we need to be pushing back against, even though there's been a pretty solid campaign since the year 2000 to bring voter suppression into a frenzy. Is there anything else? So, of course, now we are entering this runoff period where we have two important Senate races that are going to, just by the skin of the teeth, provide the Democrats 50% in the Senate if they're able to win. And that plus the ability to have the vice president cast a tie-breaking vote will give the Democratic administration more leverage if they're able to win these two runoffs that are going to be held on January 5th. Simultaneously, of course, Republicans in our state want to perhaps put up a firewall against Democratic control of the Senate, although that's a little bit difficult to see at this point because, of course, the candidates seem to need to be in alignment with the president while he is still contesting the outcome of the election. And arguably that's going to stop on Monday because early voting is going to begin and because the electoral vote count is going to happen on Monday. And that might result, of course, in the Republican candidates really pushing harder with regard to their campaign messaging about winning these races in the Senate and supporting these Republican Senate candidates, which has sort of been in question in the last couple of weeks. I say all of this to give you some perspective on the politics. This pandemic, the pandemic of white supremacy, which I think it actually is quite analogous, and race, which of course is relevant both in Georgia and in the United States, and in particular race and voting is critical in this election and others. So I'm willing now for us to open it up for questions and start to have some conversation about how the things I'm talking about impact the election. And then we can also just talk about what's happening with these runoff races and what we think is gonna happen. I am not all knowing, but I will do my best based upon what I do know to share my perspectives with you about what's gonna happen down here in Georgia on January 5th.
Thank you so much. All right, we're gonna go to questions, but before that, Adrienne, what do you think about us doing one of those polls?
Oh, what was the first one? Yes, let's do a poll. Polls are fun.
All right, let's talk about turnout. Let's talk about Voting Rights Act, then we'll do turnout.
Oh, let's talk about the voter. Okay, you choose.
Okay, turnout or Voting Rights Act?
We'll ask people about the Voting Rights Act. Let's just see what folks say.
Right,
and I think that's a longer term thing that people should just be thinking about.
Yeah.
There is a new piece of legislation, well, that was first presented in 2013. I think I said this, that's now named for John Lewis, which would reinstate the Voting Rights Act to some degree and cover 9 of the southern states, in addition to some other states. I want to say Florida, California. Florida is already a southern state, but California, there's another one in the Midwest, Michigan, I think, to try to place back some of the kinds of protections that the Voting Rights Act Section 5 was providing. Oh, I see. So particularly if we win, if the Democrats, you can tell where my affiliations lie. Although, you know, this should not be a bipartisan discussion. We're here speaking at Brown University, and I'm happy to hear from anyone who holds any opinion and perspective. But if the Democrats win these 2 seats, there is a high probability that that Voting Rights Act, that renewed act, will get some play in Congress and will potentially be passed by both the House and the Senate.
Well, the results of the poll are in, so I'll show those results. And there it is up on your screen.
Oh, I'm shocked.
So 19 out of 20 people believe that Georgia should definitely be covered. If you're one of those, well, let me ask it this way. I don't want to, you don't have to come forward, but if you want to type into the chat, perhaps, why might someone think that Georgia should not be covered? Or maybe I'll just ask the speaker because we got you. So Adrienne, what's the argument against covering Georgia? Like, what's the best argument you can think of for Georgia not being covered by the Voting Rights Act?
I mean, I would have to go with some Roberts arguments. Like, yeah. It's been 40 years. We're no longer using literacy tests. However, you know, this is happening in the midst of a period when we are passing voter suppression laws, and voter ID laws are, you know, eerily poll tax-ish. You know, in order to get an ID, you might have to pay for it. In order to pay for an ID, you got to pay for the ID that you need to get the ID. It seems to many that someone could identify themselves in a number of ways as we used to. Even if we are going to use some form of identification, it doesn't need to be limited. And the limitation of voter ID is problematic because, you know, 25% of Blacks don't have the kind of IDs that are required, for, particularly under strict ID laws states. And if you're living in a state where there's a strict ID law, that means at the poll, you're gonna get a provisional ballot. And then you're gonna have to cure that provisional ballot by showing up with your ID at some point.
We've got a couple additional questions in the chat about
questions.
Yeah, we got a couple questions about the Voting Rights Act, so I'll jump to those since we're kind of on that topic. David Abush Magder of Sandy Springs, he asked what languages are covered by the Voting Rights Act?
Oh, they vary, and I do not know them all, but Spanish, I wanna say that Hawaii is a state where it's about the bilingual ballot. South Dakota is one. And I'm not gonna be able to name them all for you, but the language minorities vary in these different states where the language provision applies. And I'm seeing somebody say, yes, I was gonna say Carol Anderson's book on One Person, One Vote, which is a riff on the Baker versus Carr, One Person, One Vote. Her book is One Person, No Vote, is a smart book to go to. Also, Ari Berman's Give Me the Ballot does a nice job of showing you sort of the development of the current voter situation.
Then another question, Christine Schneider asked about the Section 4. If those standards were deleted, what is the standard now?
I have not read the bill that is the revised Voting Rights Act. So I don't exactly know what the standard is. I do know that it would cover 9 states in the South and a couple of others nationwide, and that the idea would be states who have had, it would be similar to the former Section 4 in that it would be states that have been pointedly discriminating against minority voters in the more recent period. Yes, I think the Georgia state demographics really might be shifting strongly enough that the gubernatorial race might be affected. You know, we have more progressive voters. We've had folks shift who are older, white voters. We still, of course, have a solid Black votership in Georgia. Although turnout in the general election was not as high as people expected, I still think that Black voters in the South, in Georgia and North Carolina too, form the foundation. And many of those people, in particular, as a result of the activities of Stacey Abrams, the New Georgia Project, Black Voters Matter have been motivated to get registered and vote, particularly since 2018. And a huge number of voters has filed for absentee ballots for the runoffs who did not do so in the general election. And so I'm anxious to see, how long that's going to last. I'm also concerned, however, because we do live in a Republican-led state. The state legislature has already started for this year. They've definitely talked about switching out the electors, which Kemp has said we're not going to do. And there was apparently a presentation in the legislature this week about how to affect elections that you think are problematic. And none of the Republican members were complaining that perhaps that's not something we should do. So it occurs to me that there could be some rules changes to make things more difficult very soon. Today, there has been some back and forth about the closing of polling places for early voting in Cobb County and in Forsyth. They got the Cobb County thing worked out this afternoon. But it's this kind of thing, which tends to focus in minority areas, that could pick up again, like we saw it in the June primary or like we saw it in 2018.
So now may be a good time to jump into the last poll we have. So that question is going to be coming up. So it's two questions. The first one asks about how much do you think, you the poll answerer, how much do you think the pandemic influenced Georgia turnout in the November election? And the second question asks you, what degree do you think voter suppression influenced Georgia turnout in the November election? So please make sure to answer both questions and then hit submit.
So I would say to Robert Schwartz, I do mean Mississippi and Michigan.
I'll give you another moment to finish any.
Yes.
So the answers are coming in. And we'll use this, I think Professor Jones, I'm thinking we use this as a way to answer a couple of the voter suppression questions that we've got queued up.
Okay, fantastic.
All right, so I'm gonna end polling. Let's take a look what we got. So the results are up on your screen. Interesting, a good divergence of viewpoint here. People are split about how much the pandemic influenced Georgia turnout, somewhat a lot versus a great deal. And we're also split about the degree of voter suppression. And
so sorry.
No, please go ahead.
You guys got me revved up now. I guess in my opinion, I think that the pandemic did impact turnout in a positive manner because the use of vote by mail allowed people more access. So, nationwide, we had a huge increase in the voter turnout from the high 60% to low 70%. We're usually always below 60% nationwide. And, we're at 67%, I think, in the state. And I think a lot of that was facilitated by the ability of people to use vote by mail and also early voting. And the attention to these elections motivated people to get out and try to do it safely. So I think the pandemic did have actually a positive influence. And once the pandemic is no longer an issue, there's the possibility, particularly of the state of Georgia, saying, well, then, we shouldn't just have this vote by mail for anybody who wants to participate in it, and we'll limit it to older voters, like we've done before. I also think voter suppression influences and motivates people to get out to vote. So voter suppression, on the one hand, inappropriately prevents people from being able to cast ballots and be recognized by the franchise, even though they're registered voters. On the flip side, though, what we're seeing in Georgia, from a Stacey Abrams 2018 to now, is making it very clear for people that voter suppression is out there. And, some of those quotes on June 9th that I heard were, I will sit out here for the rest of my life, basically, if it means that I'm going to be able to cast my ballot, because I think people are very aware that there's this attempt to suppress their votes. Now, I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to have to, people having to be motivated by the fact that they're being excluded. At the same time, we see significant voter apathy, before this. So, I'm really not mad about it either, in terms of turnout in this general election.
So we got a few related questions about voter suppression. I'll go through them quickly. The first one is around how you think about the impact of voter suppression in comparison to the impact of things like gerrymandering and redistricting on especially minority voters of color.
Oh, they're all extremely important. And, of course, this is also tied to the census, right? Because, we're going to have a redistricting year. And, we cut the census short, and districting completely matters. So, we can see in Wisconsin where Democrats cast more ballots, Republicans win more seats, and this has to do with redistricting. We want one person, one vote, and that means districts that actually fit the geographical populations that are being addressed. Robert Schwartz said something. Oh, yes, one of the main issues for with runoff elections, for example, is the fact that people have to go out twice. And for minority voters, the main problems are transportation and time off work. So it is difficult for people to get out to runoff, which is one of the reasons why Grovey thought this was such a good idea. And you can see in the last 20 years that Democrats haven't won runoffs, even without the Black candidate issue. However, in 2008, the last time there was a Senate runoff, Democrats fared well. They lost, but they fared well enough and had a minimized vote share loss between the primary and the general election that left some hope that Democrats might be able to be competitive in a runoff in the future. And this year, I think that might be possible because of the attention, because of the money, because of the ads, because of the motivation for people to motivate voters to get out, because of the access to vote by mail, because of, even if it ends up being limited, access to early voting. This is a slightly different type of race. This is a Black candidate for Senate, which Georgia hasn't seen, the South hasn't seen. So there are some reasons to think that what traditionally happens with runoffs might not actually happen in this particular one.
Let me call on Claire Ritchie she's got a question. Claire.
Welcome, Claire. This is exciting. I've never used this function.
Claire, you are now on stage. And we can hear you.
So my question was just about with the success of vote by mail, what do you anticipate? There's been some talk about adding voter ID to vote by mail or other things. So it's kind of twofold. Like, what are we expecting to see for both Georgia runoff and down the road now that new success will bring new suppression tactics? So what do you see? And maybe what strategies do you think would work to overcome those?
We're a Republican-controlled state. There is definitely going to be more discussion about this voter ID by mail. One argument to be made about that is the fact that if you force people to register online, you do actually have to put your driver's license number in there. So you are already identifying people. There are also checks after you cast the ballot, which seem to be ignored, are willfully being ignored by the presidential administration in their complaints. But it's very difficult. I heard a broadcaster talking today about someone from Illinois, say, trying to get a ballot mailed to them from there. They might be able to achieve that, but when the ballot comes in, it's going to be vetted. It's not going to make it through the system and be counted in Georgia. So I think that we're going to have to continue to push back against the state legislature, because particularly after they've taken this whipping from the president in terms of reputation and, sort of the Republican Party tension that we're seeing, I think that there will be some attempts to, sort of limit voting. The demographic is changing. By 2030, this is going to be a majority minority state. That's not going to bode well for Republican control. So I would put my money on some state legislative efforts to pull back on that vote by mail, and perhaps to pull back on some other methods. And none of that is going to be reviewed under the Voting Rights Act if the stars do not align. And so therefore, those are things that are going to be able to go into real law. Well, you know, this question about coverage on the Voting Rights Act is persistent, right? One of the criticisms of the Voting Rights Act when it was actually working, now I'm talking to Michael Clark, is, you know, well, why aren't all the states covered? And part of that was a capacity problem. Like the voting rights section really just couldn't cover every single state. And I also think that, I don't know what the word is for this, but the Voting Rights Act, in my mind, worked two ways. It worked literally in covered states, and it worked with this sort of this moral effect in other states. Now, it didn't prevent this advent of voter ID and similar laws in 2000, because in order to maintain political power, Republicans need to push back against that. So I don't necessarily think it's a law that has to cover everywhere. The existence of the Voting Rights Act makes things more difficult and less cool for states that wanna act badly, even if they're not covered. And this equal sovereignty argument that John Roberts is making in Shelby, I mean, when has that ever been cited? Like once before. Lonnie Guinier and this other guy have an excellent article that they wrote after Shelby about how the equal sovereignty argument, like, I mean, it's just never used. So, I mean, the idea that states have to all be treated equally, that's not tried and true, like everybody should be able to vote, or one person, one vote. So, you know, I can't guarantee you that every state that should be state covered will be covered by a new voting renewed act, but it will be better than this free-for-all.
So Michael, I think that was your question, and you're on the stage right now, so I want to see if you had any response to that, if you want to unmute yourself. Michael Clark.
So counties outside Atlanta, Kwame, are not being neglected. You know, Warnock is traveling the state, I know for a fact. The Fair Fight, the Black Voter Project, and others are making sure that voters are touched around the state, because it's, you know, I heard Warnock saying recently he's been in counties where people can't believe he's there because he's never been there. I'm sorry, Michael, I'm coming back. But yes, Ahmaud Arbery was killed in Glenn County, and so I think that folks who are trying to improve the size of the minority franchise in the state are paying attention to all 159 counties. Hey, Kwame. Hi, Michael.
I think you did answer my question. It really was, you know, not so much having all states covered, but just there has been, like you obviously outlined, a significant amount of restriction with the voter IDs. And I know that it's not just the southern states, but there's a number of Midwestern states, like you said, where Wisconsin, where you have more Democratic voters, but you know, you have these restrictions which still allow these legislatures to be Republican. So that was just a concern.
Wisconsin is dicey, Florida's dicey, Michigan's dicey.
Even Pennsylvania, I mean,
Pennsylvania,
Democratic voters, but a Republican legislature. So.
I mean, it's a hodgepodge, and it has been. Hi, Carlos.
Hi, Professor Jones. Thank you for tonight's presentation. So if one or both Democratic senatorial nominees win the January runoff, I foresee the GOP establishment and the current administration attempting efforts to undermine the results. So other than the courts, social media static, protests, is there anything unique to Georgia that they might try that might make that successful?
To mess with the results, you're saying?
Correct.
You know, I was worried about that this time, but these are real people counting these votes. And in this instance, counting and recounting. So, I've been urging on my campus, I've been bothering people incessantly to make sure that they cast ballots, but I've been trying to encourage them in this election to really get participatory in other ways. I want people at the polls, right? So I want you to be there when the counting is happening so that you do have evidence that something is going wrong. Based upon this recount, it sort of let us know that the machines do seem to count accurately. I was concerned about machine voting. Now we've done it by machine and by hand. I would hate to believe that real people, particularly on a bipartisan basis, are not going to be able to count the votes equally. I think we have more of a threat of people not being able to get their ballot in. So I guess I remain concerned that all the ballots don't go through. But if you're not from Georgia, we have this MVP system too, where you can actually track your vote and get a text message, or you can sign in and see when your vote has gone in. But I think I'm gonna have to get a little bit more creative in my thinking, Carlos, because this last round sort of did go relatively smoothly. And then, now folks are gonna start to get creative about what uniquely they can do in Georgia to impact the system. So
Right.
I think we should be paying attention and listening, and trying to, get such that I would have a stronger answer for you as to something unique about Georgia that's going to allow them to, because as I said, I learned that this week there was a presentation about that at the state legislature prelims, which they're having right now. And I don't know what that consisted of, but they talked about some methods for impacting elections in their favor.
If I might interject, Fahim Siddiqui, I'm a senior executive, a part of senior leadership team for the Home Depot. And actually I work in tech, and I'm a late joiner to the Brown family. I was actually in the first class of IE Brown EMBA.
Welcome.
And I'm in Atlanta, and I will welcome everybody to connect with me and whatever I can do. Sometimes you come to a family early, sometimes you come to a family late.
Yes.
So this is my family. So I'm very appreciative for what you said today.
Oh, thank you.
And your intellect. And that's why I'm part of this family. And
Well, I got it from Brown.
it's a gift. I wish I lost then, but eventually I did. Come to the family. And Teresa Roseborough, our general counsel, she actually in the hanging chads election, I call it, was the one legal counsel who got a positive response and actually had a victory.
Fantastic.
And Teresa Roseborough is somebody who maybe if somebody wants to follow up.
Okay.
Of course, the counsel, she's our general counsel, a friend, that possibly we can have a follow-up on the same conversation.
Okay.
Thanks, Fahim. And Fahim, thank you so much for coming. Do you have a statement that ends in a question mark for the professor?
I wanted to offer in this.
Okay, great.
A second one, maybe possibly we can ask Teresa. This is beyond my intellect. Teresa is amazing. Possibly she can help.
Okay.
To Irvin Lustig, I would say that what we're seeing with voter suppression, from my perspective, is eerily similar to Jim Crow voting laws, right? So the party has simply changed, and the genesis, right? We haven't gone deep into the Black Lives Matter influence, but I thought that the galvanization of people around issues of criminal justice and police brutality this summer definitely drove turnout. And, as I mentioned in terms of talking about Bloody Sunday, that's an issue that has been an issue since the beginning of time in the United States. I mean, the stuff that we're talking about is the same stuff. It's just a different day.
So Kwame,
no,
quick
I
question. I
don't
want to make
think-
sure you got your question answered.
Oh, Kwame, I thought I had,
No, you answered my question. You were right on the
I
money.
still liked you being on the thing, so I just wanted to join that.
No, because I was just concerned because I did grow up in a county where people were intimidated with a history. I mean, in our hometown, you can see where people were lynched by the Ku Klux Klan, and we have it as not a historic monument, but it's a site, and we're very aware of it. So for me, it's always been like Atlanta is very far away and different from these other counties in Georgia. So you kind of answered my question because I was very concerned, like what's happening in those counties.
But part of why I wanted to speak today about sort of this expanse of this history is because this is the DNA of the state, right? And I'm saying I do live in Atlanta. I'm a relatively new resident. I've been here for about 3 years, although my dad has lived here for a long time. But you know, the reverberation of these things is alive. So even if I am not as plugged in as you and your family and community might be, I think that it's out here. And it impacts what happens in the future, and it influences the thinking of the state. To that question again about the relationship between Southern Democrats and now Republicans, it's that same kind of thing, right? I mean, white supremacy just is wily, and it is not going down without a fight.
That's right.
Hey, Bob, I think let me call on you, Bob.
Okay. Some of us were born in 1949. So some of us remember when Medgar was killed and when Viola Liuzzo was killed. Some of us sat by the radio listening intently to the cloture vote in 1964 to end the filibuster so that the Civil Rights Act could be voted upon. And we were as jubilant then as I'm told my parents' generation was during the UN partition vote on the establishment of Israel. And the kids that were born in the 70s and 80s and 90s miss a lot by not having lived through that, I think. I'm delighted that you talked about the 1876 election, which was so important. There's a million different ways we can talk about all the horrible things that happened in the past.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I just want to
Right
quickly.
now, what I'm scared about is redistricting and gerrymandering. Because I moved here in '83. When I moved here, we had 10 Congress seats, 9 Democrats, and Newt Gingrich.
Bob, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to get to the question just so we have more time for
All
other
right,
questions as well.
I'm make it quick. We had a redistricting that was done to create black seats, and what it left us with was 4 black Democrats and I believe 8 white Republicans. Now we had the suburbs creeping, and we flipped a seat in 2018 and another seat. What I want to know is, what do we do when the state legislature tries to go with surgical precision after the 6th and 7th districts? And what kind of civil disobedience can we do? I just feel like I don't want to just have to sit back there and watch it happen.
And some of that is probably what's going to happen, because it is going to take protests, right? Those functions are served by the leadership in your state house. Those are the people who determine what those lines are going to be. So it's arguably definitely going to be a problem. And I think we need to be thinking about things like renewing the Voting Rights Act. I think we need to be thinking seriously about how to keep people motivated post this runoff election in these future elections. I also think that we should start to be thinking creatively, also to Claire Ritchie, about how we vote. I've started to study some alternative forms of voting. We need to think about ranked choice voting, proportional voting. We need to think about mixing up how we are able to cast ballots, because it's that kind of legislation that's going to give people more wherewithal with their votes. We're going to need to think about opening up this vote by mail for a more permanent position, early voting with better hours, particularly if we end up with districts that are going to sort of force us into Wisconsin posture. I'm not sure if we'll have more super precincts, but I also voted at State Farm and it was really effective. I was really happy about that. So I'm hoping, I mean, I left my house, went down there and got back within an hour, and it took me 20 minutes to drive over to State Farm. So I was also pleased about that. And I might call current Republicans Dixiecrats. It's interesting. I haven't started doing that yet.
Well, as we begin to close out, I mean, if you see any questions there, feel free to jump in. But
Okay.
you know, as we think of, you know, we're going to be watching the election closely for the next 4 weeks. But you know, yeah, and one day soon the Georgia.
Yeah, that's important. So you know, early voting starts on Monday. It's going to go for 16 days. You need to check your precinct hours and availability. There should be Saturday voting some of the places, some of the time. The election is going to be on the 5th. You cannot let your family get complacent over this Christmas holiday here, folks. You really got to stay plugged in. And, you know, if you're feeling it and you feel safe enough, I urge you to go out and canvass in some of these counties so that people can feel touched and motivated to make sure they get out the vote. You know, even if whoever you are, even if we do not get the result that we would like, it is my opinion that we will all feel more satisfied about the election if we feel as if people were able to participate and that the votes were not stolen. And perhaps since we will no longer be under the current administration, there will be less of a patina of the potential for voter fraud as there is right now.
We do have one more question from someone I've upgraded to the stage, David Chai.
Oh.
Hi,
How you
David.
doing?
I'm doing good. Good to see you. Thanks.
Good to see you too.
This is fantastic. It's great to see you and hear from you. I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll just go right into my question. And that's, there's been some polling that showed that Donald Trump.
I can't hear.
Oh, can you not hear me?
Looks like we lost. Yeah, I can hear you. It looks like we lost.
I might have gotten kicked off.
Okay. No, we can hear you, Adrienne. Your video for some reason froze, but we can hear you.
The only person I can see.
Adrienne, we can hear you.
Are you still with us?
All right, looks like her video. Well, David, go ahead and ask your question. Maybe she can hear us, and if not, I'll repeat it to her.
Yeah, certainly. In case you can't hear us, Adrienne, I just wanted to ask that, you know, there's been talk about how Donald Trump gained.
I missed it. I missed everything. I got kicked off. Okay, what?
I'll be quick. So there's been some polling that suggested that Donald Trump gained his support, at least as a percentage-wise, among some voters of color. I'm curious what you make of that and what the implications might be for Democrats as they strategize.
This is important. You know, I teach at Morehouse College, and Atiba and I were talking the other day about the deep well of Republicans who are at our local HBCUs, which is not surprising. You know, if we were to do the history of HBCUs, which I won't get into. So, you know, there are Black Republicans, and if we are on the Democratic side, I think that the best that we can do is encourage people to be Democrats, but, you know, we lost Herman Cain to the Republicans. Atiba was mentioning Vernon Jordan's presence on the dais with Trump. I don't think that there's any way for us to prevent, nor should we necessarily want to prevent people from selecting the party of their choice. But they're definitely Black Republican voters. I don't know that I have the power to shift their view. You know, but generally, what I'm interested in is people understanding this history, this reality, and participating in these systems. And I feel like voter participation beyond the ballot box becomes habitual, right? So we see that poll workers, for example, tend to be in their 60s, they tend to be white, And it, so I would imagine that in any demographic, once you sort of start poll working, you keep poll working. Once you start thinking about the possibility of getting appointed to the state election board, if it happens for you once, then that becomes something that people in your circle can imagine themselves doing. So I think that people choose based upon what they think is going to give them the most opportunity. And a number of Black people think that the Republican Party is a better party for them. And I would argue that in terms of electoral office, it probably has more opportunity. We saw that in the convention, right? It was Black person after Black person after Black person.
Like Kanye.
He wasn't there though. I wonder why he wasn't at the convention. That would have been hilarious.
He was running for president on his own.
Exactly. He can't be interrupted by
he had a presidential campaign.
lesser celebrities.
Well, fantastic. We're getting to the end of our time. Last question for you, Adrienne, which is really, what are some ways we can educate ourselves? Books you recommend, podcasts? What are some ways we can do this?
I like the New York Times Daily News. They're hitting up the elections pretty regularly recently. And they talk sort of slow and funny, which I think is strange, but I think their coverage and their guests is fantastic. Carol Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote. I mentioned Ari Berman, Get Out the Ballot, Give Us the Ballot. This one, what else? I had made a little list that I then stashed somewhere. Let me see. Of a couple of other things. Oh, this book. If you are interested in the history of Georgia, I would read the Voting Rights Odyssey by Laughlin McDonald. He does a superior job of showing you the legal development of voter suppression in the state of Georgia. I know it's not about voting, but I would read Stamp from the beginning. From my perspective, it's one of the best books of the year, and it's not to be missed by people. He does a purview of the development of the view of Black people in the United States over time, and it's an excellent job. I've just read Vanguard by another Dr. Jones, who talks about Black women in voting. It's extremely vibrant, extremely interesting. I would urge everybody to order and check this out. I'm gonna read Cast next. What else? Oh, and then you said podcasts also.
The Brown Book Club read Cast a couple months ago.
Yeah, I'm just a couple pages in. I'm still on this Vanguard. And then I have another book that's Why She Marched. I don't know the author's name, and it's not about Black voters. It's about women's suffrage, although Church Terrell and Sojourner Truth are both profiled in that book. What else have I read? And Carol Anderson has more than one book. I would read them both. And then off the top of my head, this is what I can think of. I'm a big Democracy Now! Watcher. They do election coverage for me and allow me to see the stuff that I want to hear about, but also get world news. Those are my, off the top of my head, things I would suggest for right now. Oh, White Flight. And they laughed at me the last time I was at Brown because this is what I bought from the bookstore. And my friends were like, what did you get? Why would you buy that? Kevin Cruz does an amazing job of showing you segregation in Atlanta and the development. I actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, I would drive around and go see the white flight neighborhoods because what else is there to do? And so Kevin Cruz, White Flight should be read, I think, in conjunction with anything that you're reading about the state of Georgia. Oh, and if people read this, what's this book, The History? I'm probably not going to be able to find it, but this other, from Peachtree to something Street.
Read Auburn.
Sweet Auburn. So now this book is a little bit dense and difficult to get into, but I would read that alongside White Flight because then you're getting the Black and the white history of Atlanta and this political power, a little bit of the view of what's happening in the state. And then along with the White Flight, you can see the development of the neighborhoods. And of course, in Atlanta, you can see how the neighborhoods are changing. When you go in the Fourth Ward, even since I've been here, you know, I knew that was a Black neighborhood, and it is not today a Black neighborhood. But when I drive over there, I'm like, this is a Black neighborhood all day long. What's happening?
There's an 8-series podcast series called The Atlanta Legacy Makers, which takes the book Where Peachtree Meets Sweet Auburn and basically kind of does an audio, like oral history of it.
Okay.
And that came out this year. So that's The Atlanta Legacy Makers. I've put links to all these books
Okay.
in the
And
chat.
if anybody, I'm not going to remember this guy's name, but has anybody done that civil rights tour with the guy who takes the bus from in front of the Martin Luther King Center? And I don't have his name at the tip of my brain, but I have taken that tour and I thought it was excellent. It takes like half a day, so be ready. But it's worth doing, particularly if the weather is good. The day that I went, it was torrential rain. It was sort of a drag, but I would urge people to get out and check out that bus tour. It's not the Beltline tour. It's actually on a bus, so you might have to wait till post-COVID. And the Brown Club, that would be an excellent activity. Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, that's great. That's great resources. Well, thank you so much. The last thing I'll say before I kick it over to Atiba to close this out with Adrienne is there's a survey after all this. So a post-event survey. So please, 2 questions will come up on your screen. Please just give us some feedback about the event, what went well, and what we can do better next time. And then if you want to save the chat will disappear as soon as this is gone. So if you want all those links of those books, you can click on that chat right now. Select all, or even like or somehow save it. So yeah, copy and paste that if you want to save those links. I've been Andrew Stein, co-president Brown Club. Thank you so much for joining us. Atiba, will you take us out?
Well, yeah, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to give a shout out to Professor Jones for
Thank you so much for having me.
giving us your time and your talent. And I also want to encourage folks to think about running for office, because we need more thoughtful, caring, servant leaders in public office. So put that on your bucket list.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to get a chance to share the stuff that I think about all the time with the Brown Club, and particularly at this juncture in an exciting election year. Ever true.
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you again, Professor Jones, for making the time, and have a good night. Please stay safe this holiday season. Please wear a mask. Please don't hang out with people indoors so that you don't look
Please,
like.
I'd like to see you next year, and then we can hang out.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now's a terrible time to get hospitalized, so stay away from the hospital.
Yes, there's no room for you.
Have a great night. We love you.
Are you guys clicking off, or are we gonna wait?
I have to hit end, and then we'll cut us off for everyone.
Okay, so don't do that. Let's let the people leave. I
All
don't
right.
know. I'm a teacher. I always wait for the people to figure out. Just in case. Just in cases.
I can also give you guys a phone call real fast.
Bye. Sounds like there is going to be a survey. There's going to be a survey, right?
Yeah, there's after you, Claire, after you close out, the survey will pop up on your screen.
Well, thank you guys. It was nice working with you. What's the next Brown Club of Georgia virtual event?
We don't really have anything scheduled right now.
Okay.
Yeah, we used to do a holiday event, but it's kind of
Did you go to any of those dance parties that they like the vows scheduled? I did, and I danced.
How you did?
Yeah, in the kitchen. I was not mad. It was very fun with the funk night DJ. It was good, even
That's
though
good.
I was in my own kitchen. I thought it was a great idea.
Good.
So, I mean, I don't know if the Brown Club of Georgia is ready for all that.
All right, so the event is over.
Okay, fantastic.
I've